Hello and welcome back to the Stevenson Weekender sailboat build. In this episode I'm going to build the cabin top. Now, nothing against the Stevensons at all, but from the time I originally picked these plans, as a point of personal preference, I just did not like the straight up and down shape of the cabin. So from the beginning I had intended to redesign this to a more aerodynamic look. So the first thing I did was take the measurements from the plans and put them into Google SketchUp. Everything is drawn to scale, but due to limitations of the SketchUp program, or at least my knowledge of the program, this drawing is not precisely accurate because it lacks the curvature that the boat actually has. However, it got me close enough, and the next thing I did was experiment with different shapes and designs until I finally settled on this look that is represented by this wireframe. I was then able to use this wireframe to draw these cross-sectional frames. The aft frames are spaced 12 inches apart and the more forward frames are spaced 6 inches apart as the curvature becomes more drastic. Next, I copied and flipped each frame and placed it on this 4x8 foot rectangle in order to make sure everything would lay out correctly on a 4x8 sheet of plywood. Since everything is drawn to scale, I can export pictures of these frames in order to create templates that I'll use to transfer onto actual piece of plywood. I'm going to create these templates using a program called Bigprint. It's a program created by another YouTube maker named Matthias Waddell and sold from his website that I'll put a link to in the description. This program is great for printing very accurate full-size templates using a regular printer. You then use those little cross-hatched grids to line up the pieces of paper to create your template. So once I had each of the templates printed and then cut out, I laid them out on this piece of cheap OSB. I then used the mini track saw to cut the straight portions and then tried using the circle saw to cut that curve, but the radius was a little too tight for that, so I ended up doing the rest of the pieces on the bandsaw. Now I will put all the pieces together, spaced apart like I had on my drawing. To get everything lined up appropriately, I snapped a chalk line down the center of my assembly table here and then placed each frame's center mark on this line. Then it was just a matter of putting each piece in place. I then installed some blocking just to make everything more rigid. Now I'm back down at the boat shed, and to hold the frame I just created, I put in this temporary 2x6 T. I was then able to bring the frame in and set it on top of this T and get it lined up. After I had it in place, that aftmost cross-section frame was too high for my liking, so I ended up trimming that down. My plan from the beginning was to bend 1/4 inch plywood around this form to create the walls of the cabin top. Here I'm using this blue painter's tape to create a template that I can use to transfer this shape onto some 1/4 inch plywood. Now all this seemed to be a great idea in my head, but as I created this painter's tape template, it quickly became apparent that that curve up at the nose of the cabin front there, towards the front there, was a fairly extreme curve, and I was going to have trouble getting that plywood to make that much of a bend. So when I got it back to the shop, it was apparent that it would definitely not lay flat enough for me to simply draw it out, so I decided to make these relief cuts, thinking that that would work. So once I had my plywood cut out, I brought it back down to the boat and attempted to put it in place. But as I forced the pieces down to the shape of the underlying form, it was just too blocky and didn't look good. After a lot of deliberation and trying different things, I decided this just wasn't going to work the way I thought it would, and decided to abandon this plywood idea. In preparing for this project, and even now, I watch a lot of boat builders on YouTube, and a lot of them use steam bending as a method for shaping wood around curves. I've done a lot of woodworking, but I've never steam bent anything, but I had this closed steamer, and so I made a box and gave it a try. There are a whole lot of videos out there on how to steam bend wood, so I won't really go into the details of the process. After some trial and error and early failures, I eventually got the knack for it and started having some success bending these small slats around the form. All I had available was kiln dried lumber, which I've learned is not ideal for steam bending. However, I found that if I leave these strips in the steam box for a long time, like 2 hours, and then gave them a good bend and a twist right when they came out of the box, I could get them to take the shape of the form pretty easily before they cooled off. Here I switched to some leftover mahogany strips that I had, and although it was also kiln dried, it did seem to bend better than that pine that I used on the top. Once all the strips were screwed on and allowed 24 to 48 hours to dry, I was able to unscrew them and apply thickened epoxy along the edge of each and screw them back on. Now that the sides were set, I was able to move my attention to the roof. Once again, I decided to use this painter's tape method to try to get a general shape that I could then use to cut out the plywood. This worked a little better this time around because the curve of the top of the cabin is not quite as severe as that front nose part. The front piece fit pretty well, but it quickly became apparent that despite the curve being less than the nose, it was still too extreme for the wood to handle. I also realized that once the roof was on, I had nothing to attach it to, so I stopped and created these rafters. I made these out of 2 pieces of 3/4 inch mahogany laminated together to make a 1.5 inch beam. This aft rafter was easier. Its placement just happened to end up right on one of the cross-sectional station frames there, and the ends there where it meets the cabin sides wasn't as much of an angle. This forward rafter, though, was a different story. Both ends had to be cut at a compound angle. A lot of back and forth between marking and measuring and checking for fit. Then once I had the height of the beam correct, I had to bevel the front edge of the beam to get it to match the curvature of the cabin top. I did that mostly with the power planer and the hand plane. Both rafters were epoxied just to the sides of the cabin and a screw placed to hold them while the epoxy cured. Later on, I'm planning on putting a brace between the bottom of the rafter down to the deck. Okay, now that the rafters were in and I had something to screw the top to, I was back to that, but this thing just continued to fight me. No matter what I tried, I just could not get the piece of plywood to make that bend. I thought maybe that front edge was catching and causing the problem, so I trimmed that up, and I got that to fit pretty well. Unfortunately, this did not help the plywood to bend any better. I then installed these cleats between each station. I thought they might give me something more substantial to screw to. This did work better than trying to put a screw through those thin sides, but as I tried to force the plywood into place, it began to crack. So before I ditched the plywood again and had to steam bend more wood, I decided to try to cut the top into strips. And thankfully this worked great. Cutting the top into strips allowed things to overlap where they needed to overlap and allowed the plywood to easily make the bend. So once I had everything dry fit, I came back with the oscillating saw here and cut that edge off. I then applied epoxy to the edges and to the rafters, and then placed everything for the final time. To help the edges of the plywood meet up a little better, I decided to use this tile leveling system. These are used with tile floor installs so that the edges of the tiles are even with each other. Basically, there's a T-shaped flange on the undersurface of that piece of plastic that brings both bottom edges even with each other as this small wedge is pressed into the gap. These things worked pretty good for this situation, and I think it's going to save me a lot of fairing and sanding later on. In case anyone is wondering, I have the tops of those station frames covered in packing tape so that the epoxy won't stick to it. So as I did this, I began to think about alternative ways that might have made this easier. I'd love to hear any suggestions from you guys. One of the things I thought might have worked better would have been to create the station frame mold that I did already, but then place 2-inch foam insulation between the station frames that I could have carved and shaped however I needed. Then I could have covered all of that with cellophane or packing tape so that epoxy wouldn't stick to it, and then laminated the whole thing with several layers of fiberglass. I'm not sure if that would have been easier or not. I do know that this method I chose was not easy, and the boat's liable to sink with the amount of fairing compound I'm probably going to need. So now to fill in that last little strip, I went back to the painter's tape to make myself a template. Apparently when you're building a boat with strips, the last plank to go in is called the whiskey plank. So I suppose this is the whiskey plank of my boat. So now that the epoxy is cured, I'll come back and trim the edges. We'll get all of the temporary screws removed and get ready to start sanding. So I think the last thing we'll do in this video is to get the hatch opening cut out of the roof. Here I'm just following the measurements in the plans and getting the radius corners marked out. I think overall it turned out fairly well and I'm pleased with it. I think the initial fail with the plywood on the sides cost me about a month of weekends, but now that I'm finished with it, I'm happy I went this route. I still have a lot of fairing and sanding to do to get the shape exactly like I want it. My plan is then to tab the cabin top into the deck using some fiberglass strips, both inside and out. And then I'm going to laminate the entire cabin top with a couple layers of 1708 fiberglass. But I think I'll save that for a later video. As usual, I really appreciate you watching this video, and I hope you'll like and subscribe. And join me next time as I continue to build the Stevenson Weekender sailboat.